I'm glad you're a part of Connect Groups, and this next week we're continuing to look at Carey Nieuwhoff's book, Didn't See It Coming. But we're looking at this week a chapter that at first glance you may think, I don't need this chapter. The chapter's on irrelevance, and Carey talks about how often we find ourselves irrelevant to the culture around us. And at first glance you may say, well, that doesn't really apply to me. But here's the reality for all of us. None of us aspire to be irrelevant. We just often end up finding ourselves there. And in reality, this is what I mean. Think about someone's house you walked into. When you walk into their house, you think, wow, I've stepped back into time. This is like my grandparents' house. It even has the same smell. The reality for some of us, though, is this, that now when someone walks into our house, they have that same thought, but they're a grown adult, and we're not sure whether we like that thing or not. So here's one of Carey's quotes from this chapter. He says this, irrelevance happens when the language, methods, or styles you use no longer connect to the culture and people around you. Essentially, you end up speaking a language people no longer understand or appreciate. Irrelevant people eventually lose the ability to communicate meaningfully with the people they care about and to contribute to the causes they're passionate about. Sometimes it leaves them frustrated and confused as to why no one gets them anymore. In other cases, irrelevance leaves them surprisingly unaware that their influence is eroded or just plain gone. He gives a couple examples. The once sharp business leader who's no longer sharp and no longer a leader. In fact, he's looking for work. That dad who everybody loved when they coached the Little League team is now sitting at home watching television, and that's really the extent of their life. And so he adds this line, the gap between how quickly you change and how quickly things change is called irrelevance. The bigger the gap, the more irrelevant you become. We've all walked into businesses or restaurants and thought, man, this place hasn't changed since 1998 or 1988 or 1968. And we walk into those places, our initial thought probably is the same. This place no longer speaks to the world in which it's operating. And so this is true for all of us. None of us really love change, but change is one of those things that we have to deal with, whether we like change or not. But because we don't like it, we often find ourselves drifting toward irrelevance. See, culture doesn't ask our permission to change. It just does. So I remember a couple years ago, I was in a conversation with about 30 of our senior adults at our church. And in that conversation, I mentioned that we posted something on Facebook and they could check it out there. And so when I did that, a couple guys in the room kind of snickered in the corner and I said, well, what is it? And they said, well, you said it's on Facebook. Did you forget which group you're talking to? And what I knew that they didn't know, and so I asked the question, well guys, how many of you in this room are on Facebook? And all but two hands went up, those two hands in the corner. See, these two guys didn't realize that even something that seemed so far-fetched, something that seemed like it was for their grandkids, was something that their generation had also embraced. We don't intend to be irrelevant. We don't intend to find ourselves not able to speak the language of those around us. It's just one of the things that happens over time. This is what Paul wrestles with in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. Paul writes these words to the church in Corinth. He says this, though I am free and belong to no one, I have made myself a slave to everyone to win as many as possible. To the Jews, I became like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law, I became like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so as to win those under the law. To those not having the law, I became like one not having the law, to win those not having the law. To the weak, I became weak to win the weak. I become all things to all people, so that by all possible means I might save some. I do all this for the sake of the gospel, that I may share in its blessings. Did you catch that line? I become all things to all people, that I might save some. See, Paul, what he does here in this text is he embraces the idea that there's a personal accountability for being relevant to the world in which he's trying to speak. For him to have influence, he has to be able to speak the language to the community in which he's ministering to, or he's working with, or he's getting to know, or he's coaching, or he's teaching, or his kids are growing up in. You have to speak the language of those around you in order for you to have influence in that particular sphere of life. And in fact, Paul embraces this in such a good way that if we were to look at Acts chapter 2, we see Peter speak to basically the church of his day. And he preaches this message, and a bunch of people come to know who God is through the person of Jesus. But we also fast forward to 15 chapters later into Acts chapter 17, and Paul finds himself in Athens on Mars Hill, and he goes to speak to the educated people of that community. And he doesn't begin speaking a message like Peter did. He doesn't speak using language of the scriptures. Instead, What Paul does is he looks around and he says, I see you have this statue to this unknown God. Let me tell you who that God is. He spoke the language of the culture in which he was trying to have influence. And for most of us, we find ourselves living in Acts chapter 2, speaking a language that no one speaks anymore. And we've yet to miss the reality of what God calls us to is to embrace what Paul does in Acts chapter 17, to learn to speak the language of the culture in which we live. And so I want to make this a little more personal. I kind of laugh about this story because a couple weeks ago I was with our preteen group, Impact 231, and we were at McDonald's, and they have those touch screen things where you order, and I had actually never used one, and so I went to use it, and one of those 10, 11, 12-year-olds came over and said, here, let me show you how to do that. And I bristled a little bit. Maybe you've done the same thing. You're like, I know how to do this. I'm capable of doing this. And so here's the question you and I have to wrestle with. Are we willing to listen to the generations coming behind us? Or are we going to be people who choose resentment and long for the good old days? And so I love this quote. Well, comes the pushback. What about the timeless values and things that never change? It's a great question. Theologically, God never changes, and for sure, God's values are timeless. But your willingness to change gives you the ability to communicate timeless truths in a way that has meaning to those who come after you. If you want to influence the next generation or the current one, change is your friend. See, for most of us, we recognize there are some times we need to change, and we might do it then if we have to. Like I might start exercising if my doctor tells me, hey, you're going to die, or I have a heart attack. Then I might even change my diet. Until there's a fear of real loss, I'm not willing to do that. And so we don't really like change because change is painful. I might stop speaking to my spouse that way if I think they might leave me. These are things that we don't like to do. We don't want to change because we look back often and say, well, there was a day when this worked, a day when what I was doing was sufficient. And so we sometimes forget the reality for many of us is our past success hinders our future success because we're looking backwards at what we've already done. And so this quote might be helpful. For some reason, North American Christians tend to cling to the past more than they want to leap into the future. The decline of both faith and church attendance during the previous decades has been significant, and the relevance of the church to the culture has suffered as well. In my view, there's a direct correlation between the two phenomena. Yet often, Christians believe that since God doesn't change, we don't need to either. So here's 3 reasons why we often resist change. 1, we're not opposed to change, just change you didn't think of. We all get that. If I had come up with the idea for the change, I'm probably good with it. There's 1. 2, you crave what you already like. I don't know about you, but there are times when like a really good cheeseburger sounds good, but if you told me I should have a really good tofu burger, I'm kind of bristle at that. I've never had a tofu burger, so I don't crave what I've never had. And the same is true for change. We don't crave change we've never known. That's just not how we operate. The third thing is this. You encounter problems with success. What I just mentioned a moment ago. Sometimes our past success hinders our future success because we're afraid to change. We become more and more conservative in our view of what could be instead of dreaming what God may have for us. And so here's 4 ways that we can embrace change in our life. 1, love the mission more than the methods. So if we're trying to communicate with someone, love the idea of the message we're communicating more than even the language or the words in which I communicate them. This is so true for many of us because if we're not careful, we make how we do something more important than what it is we're trying to accomplish. And we see this all kinds of ways in terms of businesses. We could talk about the taxi companies, and now we find that Lyft and Uber are eating into their industry because they recognize something different, that the goal is transportation, not a certain model of transportation. And so there's number 1. We love the mission more than the methods. Number 2, we need to get radical. If we don't make large change, we don't see large results. Small change equals incremental results, and that doesn't get us very far. In fact, it probably leaves us not wanting to change at all. 3, become a student of culture. The more we understand the world around us, the more change isn't something that we're afraid of, because the reality for all of us is we cannot control change around us. It's going to happen. The only question you and I get to wrestle with is how we're going to respond to the change in the world around us. Number 4, surround yourself with younger people. Just like I learned in that McDonald's with one of the preteens telling me how to do something. Maybe you need to find someone you can invest in relationally, get to know them, and let them teach you about some of the cultural things in our world around us. And we'll find that in that, one of the ways that we find we have more influence than we ever thought possible. And so growing old doesn't necessarily mean we lose influence. In fact, what we find is the older we get, we may have greater influence when we learn how to listen to those coming behind us. And so the gateway to our best years may be still to come for some of us. And so here's the reality for us. If the church had stayed in Jerusalem and continued to only share the message of Peter, it wouldn't have got very far. In fact, it would have probably died out in Jerusalem. Instead, Paul came along and said, here's the reality of the message I want to share. I want people to know Jesus and find life in him. And that happens by going to the places where people who don't know him are and speaking the language they understand. But there's a message I want them to know, that when you know Jesus, it changes everything. And so here's the question for you and I. What are you and I willing to change, give up, let go of, so that we can become all that God has for us, for our families, for our future, for our profession, for everything in our life? Because change is inevitable, but you and I get to choose how we're going to respond to change. In fact, we might even be able to change the world if we're willing to let go of the way we've always done it for the way God may be leading us towards, if we learn to speak the language of the culture around us so that our relevance grows as we grow older, not diminished. Hope you'll have a great conversation in your Connect group this week.